At 36,000 feet above the Earth, the world usually feels distant, quiet, and disconnected. Below, the clouds stretch out like an endless white ocean, and for most passengers, it is a time of boredom, of movies, and of restless sleep. But on this particular flight, the thin air inside the cabin was about to become the backdrop for a miracle that would rewrite the future of a struggling family. Caleb was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be a hero. At 38, his life was a series of calculations: how to pay the rent, how to make the groceries last another week, and how to keep the memory of his late wife alive for their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. He was a man of quiet strength, with eyes that had seen too much loss and hands that were roughened by years of working in a dusty, dimly lit warehouse. Since the accident that took his wife 3 years ago, Caleb had lived in a state of constant survival, his only goal being to protect Lily from the harshness of their reality. He had spent countless nights staring at unpaid bills, wondering if he would ever catch a break. They were on this flight because of a desperate, final gamble. A former colleague had mentioned an opening for a logistics manager at a major global corporation across the country. Caleb had spent the very last of his meager savings on 2 one-way tickets, hoping that a fresh start was possible. If he didn't get this job, he didn't even have enough money to fly back home. Lily sat beside him, her small hand tucked into his, her face pressed against the cold window of the airplane, looking at the sunset that painted the clouds in shades of fire and gold. "Are we almost there, Daddy? Is the new house in the clouds?" she whispered, her voice full of the innocent hope that Caleb was terrified of breaking. "Soon, Lily. Soon," Caleb replied, though his heart was heavy with the fear of what would happen if he didn't get the job. The flight had been uneventful until a sudden, sharp gasp echoed from the front of the cabin, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. The soft chime of the flight attendant call button began to ring repeatedly, a frantic, rhythmic sound that signaled panic. Then came the voice of a stewardess, high-pitched and laced with genuine terror. "Is there a doctor on board? We have a medical emergency in first class. Please, is anyone a medical professional?" Caleb looked up. People began to stir in their seats, looking around nervously, whispering to one another, but no one stood. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the rows of passengers. Caleb wasn't a doctor, but before the warehouse, before the tragedy that turned his life upside down, he had spent 4 years as a volunteer paramedic. He had delivered babies in the back of ambulances and restarted hearts on cold sidewalks. The training was still there, etched into his muscle memory, buried under layers of grief and exhaustion. He felt Lily's grip tighten on his hand. She looked at him with wide, questioning eyes. He looked at her, then at the frantic stewardess who was now running down the aisle. Without a word, Caleb unbuckled his seatbelt. The old instincts, the ones that told him to move toward the danger while others moved away, surged back to life. "Stay here, Lily. Stay in your seat, and keep your belt on. Don't move until I come back," he said firmly, his voice more confident than it had been in years. He made his way past the narrow aisles, pushing through the crowd of curious onlookers. In the first-class cabin, a woman was slumped in the aisle, her face a terrifying shade of ash gray. Her expensive silk suit was wrinkled, and her breathing was ragged, shallow, and increasingly rare. She was suffering from a severe cardiac event. She looked powerful and wealthy, even in her unconscious state, but right now, she was just a human being fighting a losing battle for air. Caleb knelt beside her on the thin carpet of the airplane floor, his hands moving with a precision he thought he had lost. He checked her pulse. It was thready, weak, and then it stopped altogether. He cleared her airway and began rhythmic, powerful chest compressions. The cabin went deathly silent. The only sound was the low hum of the jet engines and Caleb's steady, focused breathing as he counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sweat began to bead on his forehead. His muscles, hardened by years of manual labor, burned with the effort. The flight attendants stood back, paralyzed by the intensity of the moment. For what felt like an eternity, Caleb fought. He didn't see the wealthy passengers watching him with a mix of fear and judgment. He didn't see the phone cameras being held up, by people recording the life or death struggle. He only saw the woman's face and the fading spark of life. "Come on," he hissed between his teeth. "Not today. Not on my watch." After several agonizing minutes that felt like hours, the woman let out a sharp, gasping breath. Her chest rose violently, and her eyes suddenly fluttered open, dark, disoriented, and full of a primal fear. Caleb stayed with her, ignoring the flight attendant's attempts to take over. He spoke to her in a low, calming voice, holding her hand and keeping her grounded as the captain announced an emergency landing at the nearest airport. As the plane touched down and paramedics rushed on board, the woman reached out and grabbed Caleb's sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who had just looked into the abyss. She tried to speak, her lips moving but no sound coming out. Caleb simply nodded, gave her a small, reassuring squeeze of the hand, and stepped back into the shadows of the economy cabin as they wheeled her away. Caleb and Lily were rebooked on a later flight. By the time they reached their final destination, Caleb was physically and mentally exhausted. He was convinced that his chance at the job was completely gone. He was 24 hours late, and he had missed his scheduled interview time. He sat in a cramped, cheap motel room that night, watching Lily sleep under the thin blankets. He felt like he had failed her once again. He had chosen to be a hero for a stranger, but at the cost of his daughter's future. The next morning, with nothing left to lose and no money for a return trip, Caleb decided to go to the corporate headquarters anyway. He walked up to the towering reception desk in his only suit, one that was slightly too short in the sleeves and smelled faintly of mothballs. He felt like an imposter in the world of glass and steel. "I know I missed my appointment yesterday," Caleb told the receptionist, his voice steady despite the tremor in his heart. "My name is Caleb Vance. I was here for the logistics interview. I know it's too late, but I had to try." The receptionist looked at her computer, then her eyes widened to an impossible size. She picked up a phone, whispered something, and then stood up. "Mr. Vance? Please, follow me immediately. Do not wait." He was led past the glass-walled offices where people in expensive suits were working, past the bustling employees, and into a massive corner office that overlooked the entire city. Sitting behind a polished mahogany desk was the woman from the plane. She was dressed in a sharp black blazer now, her presence commanding and formidable. This was Evelyn Thorne, the CEO of the world's largest shipping and logistics empire. Evelyn didn't speak at first. She stood up slowly and walked around her desk until she was standing directly in front of him. She looked at his hands, the same rough, warehouse-worn hands that had saved her life 30,000 feet in the air. "You're very late for your interview," she said, her voice cool and professional, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. I had a situation on the flight, ma'am. Someone needed help," Caleb stammered, his face flushing. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "I know. I was the situation." She walked to the window, looking out at the city she had built through sheer will and intelligence. "I have thousands of employees with impressive degrees, perfect resumes, and expensive shoes. But yesterday, I watched a man who had every reason to stay in his seat rise up when everyone else stayed down. I watched a man who didn't ask for my name, my title, or my bank balance before he fought for my life." She turned back to him and placed a folder on the desk. "You didn't apply for the right job, Caleb. I don't need another logistics manager who only cares about spreadsheets. I need a director of corporate integrity, someone who knows that the most important thing we carry isn't cargo, it's humanity. I need someone who understands that responsibility doesn't end when the clock stops." She handed him a contract. The salary was more than Caleb had earned in the last decade combined. It included a housing allowance, a premier school scholarship for Lily, and a future he had never dared to dream of in his darkest hours. Caleb looked at the paper, his hands trembling violently. "I don't know what to say. I just did what anyone would do," he whispered. "No," Evelyn replied, her voice firm. "Most people watched. You acted. Just keep being the man who stands up, Caleb. That's all the resume I'll ever need." As Caleb walked out of the towering building, he saw Lily waiting for him on a wooden bench outside, swinging her legs and humming a song. He didn't just see a little girl. He saw a future that was finally safe. He picked her up and swung her around in the air, the sunlight reflecting off the glass buildings around them. He realized then that his life hadn't been a series of failures. Every struggle, every hard year in the warehouse, and every moment of grief had prepared him for that one flight, where he found the courage to save a stranger and, in doing so, finally saved himself.